Story 1. The Quietude. The last recognizable landmark Elias Vance passed was a leaning, sun-bleached sign for a town called Oakhaven, which seemed less like a town and more like a collective delusion of 4 rusty mailboxes and a solitary gas pump that had probably run dry before Elias was born. After that, the world dissolved into the Blackwood. Elias had been seeking silence. A former English professor, recently disgraced by a petty plagiarism charge that had nonetheless shredded his career, he needed a place where the internet couldn't reach him and judgment couldn't find him. He had found the listing for the cabin, ironically named The Quietude, deep within a classified forestry newsletter. No pictures, just a description: remote, functional, total privacy. The final 3 miles were less a road and more a gravel and route suggestion. When the tires of his beat-up sedan finally crunched to a stop, the car's engine seemed to cough its last breath in protest. The cabin materialized from the dense, oppressive gloom of the pines. It was small, a single story of dark, untreated lumber, its roof burdened by a thick layer of moss. The porch sagged under the weight of time and wet rot. It looked less functional and more like a slowly decomposing animal carcass. But it was the air that struck him first. It wasn't just quiet. It was dead. Elias stepped out and immediately felt the absence of sound as a physical pressure against his eardrums. There were no cicadas, no wind chimes, no distant traffic hum. There wasn't even the rush of wind through the tall pines, which stood unnaturally still, their needles hanging like dark, silent fringe. Most unnervingly, there were no birds. The Blackwood should have been teeming with life, yet here, around the Quietude, there was only a profound, suffocating void. The Quietude, indeed, Elias muttered, his voice sounding ridiculously loud and fragile in the vacuum. The interior was sparse and smelled overwhelmingly of old dust, pine sap, and something metallic, like burnt pennies. The rental agreement had specified a few essentials: a wood stove, a bed, and a writing desk. All 3 were present, looking equally ancient. He set about unloading his meager possessions: a typewriter, a necessary relic for a digital exile, several boxes of cheap paper, canned goods, and a heavy-duty flashlight. As he dragged his suitcase across the floor, the edge of a cheap braided rug snagged, pulling back to reveal an almost perfectly square outline cut into the floorboards. Elias knelt, pulling the rug completely away. It was a trapdoor, fitted with an iron ring and secured by a massive, rusty padlock. He pulled at the ring. The door didn't budge. He jiggled the lock. It remained stubbornly sealed. This detail was unsettling. Why lock a cellar when the main cabin door had a simple latch? More importantly, why cover it up? The energy in the room seemed to coalesce around this single point, a secret buried directly beneath his feet. Elias tried to distract himself, setting up his writing sanctuary on the battered pine desk. He opened a window for ventilation. It groaned, sticking halfway up, but let in a welcome rush of cooler air, and an intensified wave of the unnatural silence. As dusk began to bleed the color from the forest, he built a fire in the stove. The crackling wood provided the only organic sound he had heard all day. He ate a tin of soup, the metallic clang of the spoon against the bowl sharp enough to make him jump. The first night, watching the observer, Elias lay on the narrow, sagging cot. He had extinguished the lantern, trusting the faint glow from the stove's glass door and the powerful moon, which was currently battling the dense canopy. He couldn't sleep. He wasn't afraid of the isolation. He had craved it. He was unsettled by the wrongness of the environment. The silence wasn't empty. It felt occupied. Around 1 a.m., the feeling changed from mere unease to acute physical dread. His skin prickled, and a cold sweat broke out on his brow. He didn't hear anything outside, which was the problem. If a bear had walked by, If a branch had fallen, his brain would have labeled it, categorized it, and dismissed it. Instead, he heard something impossible. A dull, rhythmic thud, 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 coming from directly above him. It sounded incredibly heavy. Too heavy for a squirrel. Too rhythmic for a pine cone. It was the sound of something large and dense. Something that weighed at least 200 pounds, taking slow, deliberate steps across the moss-covered roof. Elias sat up, grabbing the heavy-duty flashlight from the bedside crate. The sound stopped instantly, as if whatever it was had sensed his attention. He waited, heart hammering against his ribs. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. The only sound was the faint, diminishing hiss of the cooling wood stove. He told himself it was the house settling, or perhaps an owl. A heavy, morbidly obese owl with an extremely precise pace. He forced himself to lie back down, but he kept the flashlight clutched in his hand. Then, the thudding resumed, but this time, it was different. It wasn't pacing. It was a rapid, desperate scrape thump that suggested something with claws was trying to maintain a grip on the slick, angled shingles, possibly trying to claw its way down the side of the house. Elias leapt from the bed and stumbled toward the front door. Panic, pure and visceral, flared. He had to see what was out there. He reached the door, placed his hand on the cold brass knob, and paused. His academic mind, trained for pattern recognition and analysis, offered a cold, logical counter-argument. If it wants to get in, opening the door is exactly what it wants you to do. He backed away and went instead to the window he had opened earlier. He had to use both hands to force the sash up further. He aimed his light beam. The powerful LED cut a perfect white cylinder through the darkness and fog. He swept it across the eaves, the roofline, and the surrounding trees. Nothing. The scraping had stopped. The silence returned, deeper and heavier than before, as if the forest was now deliberately holding its breath. He shone the light into the highest branches. The trees were still, their silence now reading not as peace, but as conspiracy. He lowered the window, secured the latch, and walked back to his cot, trying to regain control of his shaking limbs. It had been the wind. It had been his imagination. It had been the sound of old wood groaning under the shift in temperature, amplified by his fear and the intense silence. It had to be. The symbol. Elias didn't sleep again. He watched the light slowly filter in, revealing the cabin's oppressive, dark wood walls. When the sun was fully up, he felt a measure of relief, though the unnatural quiet persisted. He made coffee, bitter, black, and hot, on the small gas burner he'd brought. He sat at the writing desk, intending to start work, but his gaze kept being drawn back to the window. The one he had struggled to close. The window was dusty, smeared with condensation from the night. But now, it bore a mark he hadn't noticed before. Elias stood and approached it slowly, feeling a cold knot form in his stomach. Scratched deeply into the inside of the glass, high up where it would have been near the edge of the screen, was a symbol. It wasn't crude, like graffiti. It was precise. It was a circle, drawn not with a clean line, but with a series of tiny, perfect arcs that almost overlapped, giving the impression of vibration. Inside the circle was a single, long, undulating line that looked like a sound wave, or perhaps a coiled snake. Elias ran his finger over the scratch. It was definitely on the interior surface, meaning that whatever had created it had been inside the cabin. But how? He had locked the door, and the windows were latched. He walked the perimeter of the small room, his eyes darting to every window, every corner, looking for a break-in point. Nothing. The cabin was a sealed box. He returned to the glass, studying the depth of the scratch. It would have taken something harder than a fingernail, harder than steel. It looked as if it had been etched with a diamond. When had it been there when he arrived? No. He would have noticed the glass damage when he opened the window. It had to have happened during the night. He checked the bedroom window, then the kitchen window. They were clean. Only dust and condensation. It was only on the window where he had pointed the flashlight, the window facing the depths of the blackwood. The symbol wasn't aggressive. It felt like a deliberate communication. A signature. The road out, the urge to flee became overwhelming. His career was gone, but his life wasn't. The quietude was trying to claim more than his sanity. He grabbed his keys, backpack, and the flashlight, and hurried out to the car. The key turned in the ignition, and the sedan roared to life, a jarringly normal sound. He slammed the gear into reverse and tore down the dirt track, churning gravel and mud. The road wound for about 2 miles, the trees pressing close. He was already breathing easier, the pressure in his ears lessening. He just needed to reach Oakhaven, use the gas pump, and drive straight to a motel with bad coffee and reliable cell service. Then, he rounded a bend and stopped short, stamping on the brakes. The road was gone. A colossal, multi-ton pine, perhaps 100 years old, had fallen directly across the track. Its root ball, massive and black with wet earth, stood higher than his car. The trunk lay perfectly perpendicular to the road, a barrier that not only blocked the car but made hiking around it impossible without climbing over the thick, impossible tangle of branches. Elias felt a dizzying wave of coldness wash over him. I didn't pass this yesterday. He distinctly remembered a clear, smooth drive in. He had noted the bends, visualizing the trip back. There was no way a tree of this size had fallen overnight without making a sound that would rattle the glass in the cabin miles away, or without him noticing the new, raw earth smell. He sat for a moment, letting the engine idle. The noise was a comfort, a mechanical heartbeat against the silence. He got out of the car, slamming the door. The sound echoed 3 times. Thwack, 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 before the silence devoured it. Elias walked up to the fallen giant. The trunk was wet, surprisingly slick. He ran his hand over the bark. It looked old, weathered, but there was something wrong with the cut. It wasn't a snapped trunk. It was as if it had been sheared off cleanly. He noticed something embedded in the freshly splintered wood, close to where the trunk met the ground. It was metallic, dark, and angular. He jammed his fingers into the soft bark and pulled the object free. It was a section of wire, thick and insulated, coiled around a splinter of wood. It looked like an old antenna wire, but where the wire had been cleanly severed, the end wasn't ragged. It looked fused. He dropped the wire. It landed silently in the dirt. Elias looked back the way he had come, toward the cabin. He looked forward, toward the impossible wall of wood. He realized the silence wasn't protective, it was imprisoning. He was miles from help, his car blocked, and something had been on his roof, something had scratched a message into his window, and something had dropped a colossal tree to keep him here. He took a slow, rattling breath. His options were 0. He had to go back to the quietude. Return to the center. He returned to the cabin a half-hour later, his fear curdled into a cold, determined dread. He didn't lock the front door this time. It seemed pointless. He went straight for the desk, pulling out his typewriter. He needed to document everything before whatever was happening warped his memory completely. Entry 1. Date. Current date, Day 2. The silence is malignant. It is not an absence of sound but a deliberate cessation, a holding of breath. There is a locked space beneath the floor. I believe the silence originates there. I found a symbol on the window glass, a vibrating circle. And the road is sealed by a tree that fell with no sound. As he typed the last sentence, the typewriter carriage reached the end of the line, and the bell chimed, a sharp, high ding. In the ensuing silence, something changed. It wasn't the thudding this time. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere, like a low-frequency hum starting up just below the range of human hearing. The air pressure seemed to drop. And then, he heard the faint sound of music. It was barely audible, crackling and distorted, as if being broadcast through miles of static. It was an old-fashioned waltz, tinny and melancholic. He realized the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from downstairs. Elias looked at the spot where the braided rug lay, covering the sealed, padlocked hatch. The sound of the ghostly waltz was coming directly from beneath the floor. The thing that had made the symbol, the thing that had stood on the roof, the thing that had cut the road, was waiting, patiently, for him to acknowledge its presence. He knew he shouldn't touch the lock. He knew he should run, climb the tree, or smash a window. But the silence had been broken by an invitation. A terrible, musical invitation. And Elias, the disgraced academic, was powerless against the lure of a central, terrifying mystery. He walked over, grabbed the edge of the rug, and pulled it back, exposing the heavy iron ring and the rusty padlock. The waltz below him seemed to swell in volume, welcoming him. He knelt down, his hand hovering over the cold iron. He could hear the strings of the phantom orchestra, and the faint, unsettling whisper of a woman's laugh rising up through the floorboards. Story 2. Elias knelt on the dusty floorboards, the chilling, distorted music, a scratchy, mechanical waltz, pulsing beneath his hands. The sound was too immediate, too concentrated to be anything other than a device operating directly in the space below. The tinny melody was beautiful and unbearably sad, like a memory being forced through a damaged lens. He reached for the padlock. It was an antique brass cylinder, blackened with verdigris and rust. The shackle was thicker than his thumb, fused into its own grime. It looked impossible to open without heavy tools, which Elias did not possess. But as he ran his fingers over the brass body, he felt a minute, almost vibrating warmth emanating from the lock. It was subtle, yet undeniable, as if the brass had been recently handled or subjected to rapid friction. The fear that had paralyzed him earlier now became a razor-sharp focus. He remembered the antique, tarnished brass key ring he'd been given with the cabin key. He had dismissed the smaller keys as relics, perhaps for old cupboards or forgotten sheds. Now, his mind raced. He scrambled back to the writing desk, tearing through his backpack until his fingers closed around the cold, heavy ring. There were 4 keys. The large cabin key, 2 smaller, nondescript keys, and 1 long, slender, ornate brass key with a geometric head. It was the geometric key that felt right. It matched the baroque, excessive quality of the padlock. He returned to the hatch. The waltz continued its hypnotic, looping melody. Elias braced himself, inserting the slender key into the lock's almost invisible keyhole. It was a perfect fit. He turned it slowly. A sharp crack of breaking rust was followed by a satisfying, metallic thunk. The shackle sprang open. He held his breath, waiting for the waltz to stop, for the whispering to cease. But the music simply continued, slightly louder now that the internal mechanism was disturbed. Elias lifted the heavy iron ring and, with a shuddering pull, dragged the trapdoor open. It resisted, screeching in protest, the only natural noise he had heard from the house all day, and then thumped against the floorboards, revealing the darkness below. The stench that rushed up was not foul, but overwhelming. A dry, clean smell of aged paper and preserved air, mixed with a sharp, sweet scent, like dried herbs or burnt sugar. He aimed the beam of his heavy-duty flashlight down into the gloom. The cellar was shallow, perhaps only 6 feet deep, its walls lined not with concrete but with meticulously stacked, smooth river stones. It was drier than any normal cellar in a damp forest should be. He found a wooden step ladder fixed to the floor of the room and descended carefully. The music intensified immediately, no longer tinny but richly present, vibrating in the stones. It wasn't coming from the air, but from the ground, resonating through the very structure of the earth. The beam of his flashlight revealed the source. It was positioned on a small, hand-hewn table in the center of the room, an ornate Edison cylinder phonograph. It was brass and polished mahogany, covered by a thin shroud of dust, but otherwise immaculate. The massive, tulip-shaped horn was aimed directly at the center of the ceiling, at the place where the trapdoor opened. Elias slowly approached the table. The phonograph was playing. A delicate, wax cylinder was turning, and the needle was tracking the groove, creating the melancholic waltz. He didn't see an electrical source. The machine was clockwork, powered by an internal spring. The sound was pure, high fidelity, and absolutely chilling. He watched the cylinder spin for a moment, then, unable to bear the endless loop, he reached out and gently lifted the needle. The silence that returned was instantaneous and total. It crashed back down onto him, heavier, darker, and colder than before. It felt like being submerged in freezing oil. The air felt brittle, ready to shatter. Next to the phonograph, stacked neatly on the dusty floor, were 3 items. A heavy, leather-bound journal, secured with a latch. A small, polished wooden box that looked like a jeweler's case. A thick bundle of yellowed, blueprint-style schematics, rolled and tied with twine. Elias ignored the cold dread and the tightening pressure in his chest. His academic curiosity, the same impulse that led him down 1,000 research rabbit holes, now took over. He grabbed the journal. The architect's journal. The leather was supple and cold. He flipped the latch easily. The handwriting inside was spidery, precise, and dated 60 years prior. Elias began to read the introduction by the author, a man named Dr. Alistair Finch. Entry 1. July 12, 1965. Arrival at the site. The Blackwood is perfect. They dismissed my hypothesis at the Institute, calling it acoustic mysticism. They called it a fool's errand to believe that the total absence of ambient sound, the quietude, could rewrite the neurological architecture of the human brain. They cannot fathom that the absence of external signal is not just a void, but a powerful, active force. This cabin, this quietude, is a scientific instrument. I have lined the walls of the chamber with a specific combination of river stone and lead to achieve maximum sound dampening, far exceeding the capabilities of any modern anechoic chamber. It is designed to expose the occupant not to silence, but to the self-signal. Entry 14. August 3, 1965. The effect is immediate. When the external world is silenced, the internal world, the constant, high-frequency biological noise of the body, becomes deafening. I hear the rush of blood in my ears, the scraping of cartilage, the faint, electrical hum of my own nervous system. It is excruciating. But this is the key. By forcing the mind to listen only to itself, one begins to hear the residue. Elias paused, his heart pounding. The malignant silence he had felt. Drive. Finch had designed it. He skipped forward, his eyes scanning for mention of the waltz or the cymbals. Entry 45. September 19, 1965. The silence is not a vacuum. It is a filter. It began a week ago. First, the pacing on the roof. I initially dismissed it as thermal contraction, but the weight is too profound. Then, the visual component. The symbol, the vibrating circle, I call it, appeared, scratched on the inside of the window glass. The force required, it is not human. I believe the silence is not merely dampening external frequencies, it is allowing the high-frequency internal signals of the brain to resonate, to bleed through the temporal boundary. The entity I am perceiving is a projection of extreme, lingering dread, made manifest by the unique acoustic conditions of the chamber. The music. I must use the music. It is the only way to modulate the silence. I have tuned the brass cylinder to a specific frequency, an old, familiar waltz, the Dreamer's Farewell, designed to generate a counter vibration. If the silence is the absence, the waltz is the acoustic anchor, the singular point of normal rhythm that prevents total cognitive collapse. Elias felt the logic of madness grip him. Finch hadn't been trying to escape the horror, he was using the horror as an instrument. He flipped to the last complete entry. Entry 98. December 24, 1965. Christmas Eve. I can no longer distinguish between the internal and external signal. The woman, the one whose whisper rides the acoustic anchor, she has a name. She calls herself Eliza. She is the source of the dread, the history of this place, and she is asking for the key to the chamber of sound. The symbols are no longer on the glass, they are in the stone. They are warnings. I hear her laughing now, just behind the music. It is joyful. She is joyful because she has realized the cabin is not a prison for her, it is a battery. I have secured the final, most crucial device in the safe. I must destroy the cylinder. I must break the music. The quietude must remain sealed. I am leaving this journal, this warning, but I will take the essential piece with me, away from the chamber. I cannot let Eliza fully manifest. She only wants one thing: to be heard. The final entry was just a smear of ink, a frantic, illegible scribble, ending abruptly. Elias looked at the phonograph. He had lifted the needle. He had killed the acoustic anchor. He had let the malignant silence return unchecked. The wooden box and the schematics. He placed the journal down, his breath hitching. The blueprints lay open on the floor, detailed schematics that showed the cabin was indeed built atop a circular foundation of dense rock, designed to absorb and contain sound waves. The cellar was an anechoic core. He picked up the small, polished wooden box. It had a delicate silver clasp. He opened it. Inside, nestled on old velvet, was a single object. A small, silver key, similar in shape to the one he had used, but clearly different. It was marked with the same vibrating circle symbol that had appeared on the window. This was the key to the chamber of sound Dr. Finch had mentioned. But the strongbox Finch had referenced was gone. Or was it? Elias looked around the shallow cellar, sweeping his light beam over the meticulously stacked river stones. They looked uniform, ancient, and sealed. He noticed that one section, directly opposite the trapdoor, did not reflect the light the same way. The mortar between the stones there was newer, a slightly different color. He put the silver key back into the wooden box. He returned to the wall, pressing his ear against the cold stone. Nothing. Total, absolute silence. He pressed hard against the section of newer mortar. It gave way with a puff of dust. A small section of the wall, about the height of a refrigerator, swung inward on hidden, perfectly oiled hinges. Behind it was a space barely large enough to step into, illuminated by the powerful flashlight. It was not a room, but a small alcove, a built-in safe, secured by a heavy, modern-looking steel door with a dial lock. This was the chamber of sound, the final mystery. The strongbox was a vault. Elias's finger traced the lines of the symbol on the silver key in the wooden box. The key to the chamber of sound. He had found the lock. But he did not have the combination. He tried to force the door, pulling at the steel handles. It was bolted tight. The return of the signal. Just as Elias pulled his hands away from the cold steel, the air shifted again. It was a sharp, physical jolt, like static electricity discharging. Then, the floorboards above him, the floor of the main cabin, began to creak. It wasn't a natural settling. It was heavy, deliberate pacing, moving from the desk toward the hearth, and then, slowly, toward the trapdoor. Thud, drag, thud, like something enormous and clumsy was walking directly overhead. Elias froze, his light pointed at the ceiling above the cellar steps. He was trapped below. A new sound joined the pacing. A soft, metallic squeak-click, squeak-click. Elias realized with sickening clarity that the unseen entity above had found the phonograph. It wasn't the pacing that was terrifying. It was the realization that whatever was upstairs was actively trying to restart the music. He could hear the creature manipulating the delicate mechanics of the machine. The squeak-click of the brass gears being wound. The drag of the heavy spring. Then, a sudden, sharp, clattering sound. The phonograph needle being dropped too forcefully onto the wax cylinder. The waltz began again. But this time, it was not the melancholic tune. It was frantic, sped up, and the volume was turned up to an almost unbearable level. The frantic, high-pitched strings shrieked through the cellar, vibrating in Elias's teeth. The acoustic anchor was now a tinnitus alarm. And riding on top of the screaming music was the sound Dr. Finch had mentioned, clearer than ever, Eliza's laugh. It was a high, joyful, utterly unhinged sound of pure triumph. The laugh and the music were overwhelming, driving Elias to his knees, making his head feel as though it would split open. The cellar, the place of perfect silence, was now the center of a sonic assault. He clapped his hands over his ears, but the sound was internal, resonating through his skull. Through the shrieking waltz, a voice, Eliza's voice, cut through the noise, a breathy, confident whisper that was somehow louder than the music. He had to break it, Elias. But you brought it back. Elias scrambled up the ladder, desperate to reach the phonograph, to destroy the cylinder. He pushed the trapdoor open with a violent shove and rolled back onto the cabin floor. The room was empty. The door was still ajar. The phonograph sat on the desk, playing the high, frantic waltz at maximum volume. But lying next to the phonograph, exactly where he had left his typewriter, was a new item. A second, duplicate wooden box, identical to the one in the cellar. Elias stumbled toward it, ignoring the screaming music. He tore the new box open. It was empty, save for a small, rolled-up slip of paper tucked into the velvet lining. He grabbed the paper and unrolled it with shaking hands. It wasn't a note. It was a perfectly rendered diagram of the dial lock combination for the steel vault in the cellar. And written in pencil, scrawled beneath the combination, was a single, elegant word. Listen. The malignant silence was gone, replaced by a malignant sound. The presence was no longer waiting. It was actively communicating, guiding Elias deeper into Dr. Finch's prison. He now held the combination to the chamber Finch sealed, the chamber he believed held the essential piece needed to finally manifest Eliza. I've brought Elias to a clear choice. Descend back into the sound-dampened cellar, punch the code into the steel vault, and confront the history of the Quietude, or flee into the unyielding forest. What lies inside the sealed vault? Is it the truth about Eliza, or is it the key to reversing the silence? Let me know, and we'll write the next chapter. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.